Welcome back. Dr. JC here, week 9, the second half of this class. Time is certainly not standing still, that's for sure. Now in this week, many moving parts, lots of important events and people to bump into for sure this week as it relates to early American history. These decades of the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, tons going on to be sure. And because there are so many moving parts, I think I'm going to break this lecture into 2 parts. We're going to take the politics of the period in the first part, and then we'll do some social and cultural discussion in part 2. So with that said, let's jump into the politics here in part 1 right now. Now, as mentioned in the last lecture, these 3 cats right here, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun from Kentucky, Massachusetts, and South Carolina, respectively, or West, North, and South, respectively, from a sectional standpoint. These 3 individuals are lions of Congress during this period. Each of them has aspirations to be President of the United States. Each of them has a desire to do what's best for the people of their section of the country. Each of them at times will write or campaign in language we might recognize as being pretty sectional, pretty partisan today. But understand, underneath all that rhetoric, each of these individuals believed in a strong United States. They believed in this federal union. And at the end of the day, each of these individuals will recognize that compromise makes very good sense. That sometimes getting 50% of something is way better than getting 100% of nothing. And so we'll be talking about these 3 individuals in the coming weeks. And together, as mentioned previously, these 3 are known as, in Senate history, the Great Triumvirate. And they're remembered that way, rightfully so, because these 3 cats are going to be around for all of this important stuff that happens from 1810 to 1860. All 3 of them will enter Congress as first-term freshmen in 1810 and 1812, and they'll be around all the way to the eve of the American Civil War. So all of these events that we're going to talk about over the next several weeks, these 3 cats are going to be central players, central figures in their sections of the country. And so if I'm hammering home these 3 cats, there's a reason for it. Because when we talk about antebellum American history, and whenever you hear the word antebellum, think of before the American Civil War. Talking about American history before the American Civil War, these 3 names you have to remember, because these are 3 key players, 3 key decision makers, and 3 key, largely, compromisers. So with that, let's jump into the first political hot potato these cats had to deal with, which was this tariff in 1816. Well, we talked about this tariff of 1816 last week. I want to reintroduce it here briefly as a way to foreshadow a much larger fight that's going to take place in 1832, this so-styled Tariff of Abominations, which is ultimately almost going to lead to American Civil War in the 1830s. You'll recall that the tariff was a central component of Clay's American system. They had to pay for these internal improvements. This was one way to potentially do it, while at the same time promoting Northern industry, American industry. And while the South wasn't crazy about it, they largely went along with it because of newer voices, newer blood in Congress, such as John C. Calhoun I just mentioned. When Calhoun comes to Congress initially, he is an ardent nationalist and a bit of a war hawk too. And as a result of this, the South rolls along with this. It says, okay, let's focus on expansion of the country. As it relates to expansion of the country, you have to talk about this Missouri Compromise that takes place in 1820. Following that blueprint established in the Northwest Ordinance, folks settle in the Missouri Territory, they establish a legislative assembly, they draft up a constitution, and they apply for statehood. Seems straightforward until Congress took up a vote on said statehood. And it was during this debate that the ultimate central cause of the American Civil War will emerge, and it has to do with the extension of slavery into the territories. A representative from New York by the name of James Talmadge Jr., pictured here on the left, introduces an amendment to the bill relating to the admission of the Missouri Territory into a state, and Talmadge requests that Missouri be admitted as a free state. There were several issues individuals took with Talmadge's amendment, however, North and South, mind you. It's important to understand Talmadge isn't an abolitionist. He wants to get rid of the institution of slavery. Now, he's not outlawing slavery immediately in Missouri. He's introducing legislation for gradual emancipation, which if you're from the South, you don't care. You're not abolishing the institution of slavery. It's legal property. Deal with it, bro, right? And they will overwhelmingly vote against this amendment. Northerners, however, too will take some issue with Talmadge's amendment. And while they might be open to discussion about abolition, they might be open to the ideas, they hate the idea of putting conditions on statehood. That was never meant to be. According to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, people within a territory would be able to decide for themselves based on this concept known as popular sovereignty. We'll come back to this again, trust me. And that it wasn't up to Congress or congressional representatives, whether in the House or the Senate, to put conditions on statehood. It was to be left up to the individuals of those territories to decide. So Northern opposition, while not huge but enough to kill the amendment, said people should decide in a territory whether they be slave or free, not Congress. And so we're at an impasse here. What do you do with Missouri? Enter Henry Clay, one of our great triumvirate, also known as the Great Compromiser. And he will put forth a compromise plan. He says, look, there's this territory that's held by, claimed by Massachusetts. It's what we call Maine today. Why don't we just partner up here? And if Massachusetts is okay, let Maine go its own way. Why don't we bring Maine on board at the same time we bring Missouri on board? Missouri itself can be brought in as a slave state, Maine brought in as a free state. We maintain balance in the Senate, and then we'll figure out what we're going to do with slavery in the territories when we move forward. But for right now, let's do this deal. Let's bring Missouri on board and we'll bring Maine on board. Maintain the balance in the Senate. Everybody chill. Everybody pass this. Everybody move on. The country expands. And with that crisis averted, 2 new stars on the flag. Before moving into the final 2 salient political events that we'll talk about here right now, the election of 1828 and then this tariff controversy and nullification crisis, as it's called, I wanted to point everyone's attention to the map here. You'll notice the yellow Arkansas territory, and then north of that unorganized territory shaded in blue. And then there's this line called this 3630 Missouri Compromise line. And of course, everything to the west, it says Spanish possessions, right? As part of the Missouri Compromise, a line was put in, and only Congress can do it in its infinite wisdom, right? At the southern part of Missouri. And this Missouri Compromise line basically said any new territories to the north that apply for statehood would be considered free, with the exception evidently of Missouri, which is north of that line. But again, this is Congress in its wisdom, right? But I want you to keep that line, that 3630 line, in mind, because we'll come back to that later in the course. The other thing as it relates to this map, however, if we look at this, we could furl an eyebrow if you're from the South. I mean, there's a heck of a lot more blue than there is yellow, right? So how many more states are we going to be able to carve out of this Arkansas territory versus all that stuff that's in blue? And if we're looking to maintain some balance in the Senate, we got to find some land somewhere else, right? You see all that stuff in gray? Yeah, that might become a target, north and south. Keep that in mind, because in the 1840s, the U.S. is going to go to war, and they're going to look to pick up that real estate. I mentioned the election of 1828 and this election of 1832 as well, and I wanted to talk briefly here now about changes in the electoral process and system, specifically access to the ballot box. As we move through this antebellum period, again, this period meaning before the Civil War, more individuals are going to call for access to the ballot box. And so by the time we get to 32 here, 1832, most states have adopted near universal white male suffrage, meaning property requirements, so on and so forth, that used to be in place in the colonial period, early republic for sure. Those are by the wayside now, and if you're white and male, you can go vote as a general rule. And with this new influx of voters, a different type of politician begins to emerge, and we see that in Andrew Jackson. Jackson, this war hero from 1812, this hero of the Battle of New Orleans, you will recall, that was fought after the war was technically over, right? He's going to ride that fame throughout his campaign, and he's going to campaign to the average Joe, and he's going to focus on rural voter turnout. The common person is who he's focused on here. And they will turn out on election day and they will put him in office. Now, for those that were pushing back against expanding the electorate, opening up the democracy, so to speak, against the founders' wishes in many ways. If they were looking for fodder to support their cause or case, they needed to look no further than what happened on Jackson's inauguration day. Celebrating the first of what would be two inaugural addresses here in 1828, Jackson will be reelected in 32. Following his inaugural address, the crowd just kind of followed him back to the White House, and it just kind of became this let's trash Jackson's place frat party deal. Crowd spills into the White House, and they just more or less kind of tear up the joint. And they left the blue bloods of the world, as the Supreme Court Justice's Joseph Story, to say, oh my, King Mob is here. Yes, they've unleashed the people on us. Good heavens. Beyond the new voters that Jackson brought into the fold, for good or ill, depending on how one views it, right? Jackson also unleashed what we refer to today as the spoils system. Not necessarily the best thing. There had always been this sort of long-standing tradition that once an administration changed, one going out, one coming in, key administrative people would be retained in their positions and roles to provide a good transition or continuity from one administration to the next. Yet when Jackson came in, he said, hell no. All y'all old folks, old administration, you're out. My people are in. To the victor go the spoils. And whether or not that makes good sense, maybe it would have been better off leaving folks in place that knew where the Keurig coffee machine was and bathrooms were. The bodies are buried, so to speak. Maybe that would have made better sense. But with Jackson's spoils system, it's what we got today, for good or ill. And we'll talk more about the impact of Jacksonian democracy, as it's called, in the weeks ahead. But I want to pivot to the last topic here, a very, very important, impactful one. This nullification crisis, as it's called. Now, this nullification crisis is going to come about because of tariffs. Here we go again with these tariffs. I know you guys are like, please, dude, you're killing me with this stuff. As previously mentioned, the tariffs never helped the South. They don't. And in 1816, they agreed to one to help grow industry across the country. 1824, a higher one still was passed. And in 1828, an even higher tariff was passed. Now, there's a whole side story as it relates to that we can't get into here. You guys are more than welcome to Google it, right? This so-style tariff of abominations. It was such a bad bill. The South helped write it. Part of the reason they helped write it is because they wanted to drive a wedge between the current sitting president, John Quincy Adams, who's from the North, and Henry Clay, who's from the West, to help garner votes in the North for Andrew Jackson. Remember, Jackson's running for president in 1828. Well, crazy as it was, this higher tariff gets passed. Self-inflicted wound for the South. John Adams signs it into law and becomes hated in the South, which opens the door then ultimately to Jackson's election in 28. All that aside, the South stuck with this super high tariff. And to give you some sense of how debilitating this tariff could be, how much economic pressure it put on the South, it would be considered higher than the one that was enacted during the Great Depression in the United States, that Smoot-Hawley tariff that was passed in 1930. So if we remember the Great Depression as being really bad, this tariff was even higher. So imagine how that fell on Southerners in 1828. Sensing an opportunity here, John C. Calhoun's the current sitting vice president of the United States, might want to be president himself, decides to use this as an opportunity to gain solid support from the South. And in 1828, he pens this South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Drawing from Jefferson's notion of interposition, as evidenced by those Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, as evidenced by the Hartford Convention, Calhoun says this is BS. There's no way folks in South Carolina are paying for this federal tariff. We're not doing it. And within this exposition and protest, he outlines how a state can actually nullify a federal law. You hold a special convention, and your delegates can vote down this law. That's simple. And if the federal government pushes back further, a state reserves the right, says Calhoun, to secede, to leave the Union. So this exposition and protest becomes just that, a blueprint for secession. Jackson hears about this as his own sitting vice president's pissed, threatens to send federal troops to the South. Calhoun, in turn, resigns as vice president of the United States, and it looks like we're going to have civil war. Enter Henry Clay, and the great compromiser will hammer out a deal between North and South to keep the Union together. But the South now has a blueprint. If federal authority gets too oppressive, we can act.